Hi, I'm Rafael Gomez, host of Speaking Freely here on TLN, and over the last several weeks, host of the Toronto mayoral candidate interviews. Today we have Mark Saunders, former Chief of Police for the City of Toronto, and one of the frontrunners in this city's mayoral race, which will occur on June 26th, at least the vote will. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So the way I've started all these interviews with the candidates is to let them tell us why they've joined the race. The city's big, it's facing a lot of issues, a lot of problems. It's a very contentious election. Why did you decide to throw your hat in the ring?
Well, first off, the first and foremost reason is because I love this city. This city has given me an opportunity to aspire to things that I never would have dreamt of in my entire life. But right now, after raising my family and living here for 40 years, I strongly believe that our city is at a turning point. When we look at the crimes, the violent crimes, when we look at disorder, and when we just look at the whole dynamics of the city, it has changed. And right now, we have to tip it back in the right direction to the city that I loved. When we talk about Toronto being safe and being clean, from the people that I've spoken to who feel the same way as I do, there are a lot of things that need to be done and things that we need to have a focus on. You know, if you don't have a safe city, you don't have a healthy city. And if you don't have a healthy city, you don't have a prosperous, vibrant city. A city that is supposed to bring in newcomers. Yeah. I come here as a newcomer, and we have to plan for our future. And when we talk about living in a world within a city, which is what Toronto's identified, government has a responsibility to make sure that that environment is created to ensure that people that do come here have a fair chance at the Canadian dream.
Sure. It's funny, you mentioned something that sprung to mind, a memory. Toronto was once known as New York run by the Swiss. And it's more like the inversion now, right? It's like we've got the disorder of New York, but without the kind of efficiency that we used to have. It's not quite fitting together. I would agree with you. I think if you look at all the candidates that have come through here, regardless of their stance and what political leanings they have, left, right, progressive, conservative, I think they've all admitted what you've just said. There's something broke with the largest city in this country. I'm going to give you a chance to talk more about that and some of the policies you have, but maybe bring us back to the role that you inhabited before entering politics. You were chief of police in the largest city in Canada, yes. The largest police force. Tell us a little bit what you learned there that has made you think that you can run the city, but also the journey that took you there. You alluded a little bit to it. You got a lot of opportunities here, but tell us a bit about that journey.
So I had the privilege of joining the Toronto Police Service in 1982. So we're talking 38 years of public service, and that's what this race is about. It's about leadership, and it's leadership in public service. Government's role is to create those environments for those opportunities for people that live, work, and play in this fantastic city. So at the lower rung, I worked through many, many specialized units and basic units as well too. But each and every time it was interacting with people right across the city, north, south, east, and west, a lot of times through crisis, but also in good times. But when you fast forward to being the chief of police, you see a totally different version of the city. You start to meet people that really have positions to help change lives and who have had opportunity and who have made their journey to a different path. And from that other end, what I've learned is that people care. And that's what separates Toronto from any other city. People care. So when you combine those two entities together, from learning from dealing with people and learning from people who want to provide opportunity and help, that defines Toronto. And so having that 38 years of knowledge and opportunity, I know that I can bring those tools to City Hall to make sure that the right decisions are made. Because right now, the disconnect is people aren't paying attention to city government because they're not answering the fundamental question. And the fundamental question is, how are you working with us, community, to create opportunities? And we're just not seeing that.
And, you know, 1982, you mentioned, was your start in the police force. Yes. Toronto was a very different city. It was multicultural then, but it's become even much more diverse in those intervening years. Talk us through some of that learning, because it was very specific. You mentioned that once you were on the streets learning through the various roles you had, yeah. It flipped when you became a chief of police. There were people in positions that you thought could effectuate change. Beyond the order and disorder file, which I would think people would score you very high on, what else have you learned that can speak to the problems that we talked about before we started rolling, the small business sector, the main streets, which are also seemingly falling into some sort of disrepair, feeling that it's not safe to not just be on the TTC, but in our main streets. The pandemic obviously had a big impact. Lockdowns affected the small independent business sector. And to tie it back to where we're kind of rolling and shooting this interview, we're in the northwest part of the city, a multicultural area.
Yeah.
A lot of the recent immigrants that come to Toronto set up businesses. And they're the ones that are feeling the biggest challenges right now in the post-pandemic kind of lockdown world. Do you have any sort of policies that emanate both from your experience as chief, seeing the different communities, and also this challenge that's being felt at the social and economic end?
Sure. So, there's a lot to unpack.
Definitely.
But I can tell you right now that this pandemic has really taught us a lot of lessons. And one of the things that is key and critical is to make sure that we have government that has evergreen processes, that has the ability to learn and adapt to today's environment. I feel that government has moved more in a linear direction than the exponential direction, which is, if we're going to be competing against the world, we have to be able to move faster. And one of the biggest issues that intertwines with everything is just affordability, especially when it comes to housing. When we look at the experts in the review that just came out a couple of weeks ago, Toronto scored last. It scored last. And they say in order to meet with the times of what we need today to answer a lot of these questions, we have to move at a rate of 160% faster than we do now. So making sure this is a leadership competition and having leaders that have the ability of understanding what the most important needs are, and then prioritizing them and not getting dissuaded by special interest groups that really slow processes down. And in return, the rumor I've heard is every day passes, things become more expensive, not cheaper. So we're basically double taxing ourselves with these processes. But with the small businesses, we have to make our city vibrant again. We have to increase the foot traffic on the sidewalks and then the subways that are at 70% right now. And in order to do that, it starts with the basics. Making sure that people feel safe, that's number one. And then as government, looking at some of the other best practices out there to figure out what can we do to incentivize businesses, especially small businesses. And Toronto does a good job with some of the things when we have the Winterlicious and all kinds of different incentives.
The summer festivals and so on,
Exactly. So there are ways and opportunities, but right now the number one issue is people aren't coming into the city. People aren't going out as much. And then we have a whole new dynamic now because of the pandemic where people don't want to work 5 days a week and they want to work 3 days a week. So we have to rejig the formulas to figure out what happens when people are leasing these footprints. However, the traffic is going to be changing. So as government, we have to be able to properly understand what the story is for today's environment and then creating the right policies to make sure it's conducive so that these businesses survive.
Absolutely. And I've heard, part of my research as a university professor is to look at labor markets. And actually one of the things that's coming up with our recent immigrants is that they're basically faced with an unrealized dream when they get here. The cost of living is so far out of line with what the income they're earning, either as an entrepreneur in a small independent business or as a job. It's really now kind of trickling back. I think the continual flow of this dynamic immigration that we've created here in the entire country is at risk because of what's happening in its largest city, the city of Toronto. So I like that idea. But give us an idea of what you could do to help remedy that. Just a plan or two.
So first we have to make Toronto more appealing. And you brought up something that was very important. When we talk about the newcomer experience, and I've been, since I've put my hat in the ring and had discussions through various communities and cultures, I'm hearing stories of people leaving Toronto. I'm hearing stories of people that are here that are doing better than they expected, but they're telling people back home not to come to Canada right now. So the partnerships that are necessary from a federal and from a provincial perspective are key and critical, making sure a mayor has that strong relationship. Number two, knowing that the person has already had the ability and skills to do this is critical and important. So with me, collaboration is key and important in order to be successful, but in order for business to thrive, people have to want to come to the city. And so when you have different people that are here saying that it's not a good time, we have to listen to that. I came here as an immigrant. My parents, 6 kids, came to Canada, and it was to get a better education for their babies. And then from there, we grew and we developed. But right now, people don't feel like they're being set up for success. And there are a lot of things that have really been political decisions instead of sticking to our foundational things and our foundational roles and responsibility as city government.
There's another layer here that I want to bring in. I've brought this up with other candidates too. The city is big, and it used to be governed in a different way. It had a metro governance structure, and when you were working as a police officer in 1982, that was part of a metro government, and it worked really well. I'm not going to go through all the history, but in the 1990s that ended. We created one city, and all these city governments that were around the periphery folded into one city hall. There's a feeling, and especially when you come out here to places in northwest of the city. We're sitting here in what was used to be called North York, a separate city. People feel alienated from downtown, from City Hall. What do you do to... You probably can't de-amalgamate the city at this point, but how do you recreate those structures where people feel connected to their city government, which, if you're living where we are, is pretty far from downtown Toronto and downtown City Hall? Do you have any ideas about listening and creating links between the broader part of the city, what's sometimes called the inner suburbs, and the sort of downtown core that tends to listen in an echo chamber to itself?
Yeah. Well, I think that there is a responsibility that works from two lenses. First and foremost, people have to understand the power of the vote. And so understanding that representatives from your community are going down to City Hall, they have a role and responsibility to represent your voices and your lenses and what you feel is valuable for your living experience. And it is the city, but there are many different aspects of the city. So there is no one size fits all when you talk about going from metropolitan Toronto and breaking it down. So there's a good thing with respect to identifying different sections of the city for their values and needs. But what is a measuring tool that shows that that is exactly what's happening? So I feel that's part of the voter apathy. My role and responsibility, my desire is to make sure that every voice is heard. Whenever certain segments of community feel that they're not listened to or heard, then they turn right off. And that is something that is near and dear to my heart. From going across the city into all of the communities and cultures and having an understanding, I'm plugged in. And that is a continuous role. And I hope by leading by example, of going into places where most politicians don't go unless there's a crisis. That's not success. Success is when you're in the communities when nothing is happening and doing your gut check and talking to community. It's not about a bag of money. Sometimes a coordinated effort from members of the community will have more holistic and sustainable conclusions to them than what is happening right now. And so just one quick thing that I'm doing, it's called Project 224, where as mayor, if I'm chosen, I will be doing 200 floors right across the city minimum every single year and walking 24 miles, understanding our vertical footprint and understanding our horizontal footprint and asking, as mayor, how are we doing? Where are the disconnects? We serve community. We have to be able to understand our roles, and we have to validate it through our actions, not just our words. And that's one of the things, the reasons that I'm running, because I think that some of us are missing the mark. And that's critical if we're going to get this right.
Yeah, and I'll just reveal my cards here. I grew up in the east end of the city, Scarborough. There's still a lot of Scarborough pride. People still, when they say where they're from, they'll say Scarborough first before the city of Toronto. So that's where I'm coming from. And I want to bring you back to maybe an issue that we started with, which is, you know, your former role as chief of police and your experience as a police officer. It's probably given you insights into areas around crime and disorder that other candidates don't. That's probably obvious. What is it that you can bring to that story for Torontonians? That you said perceptions of safety are low, and therefore people aren't going out, which then affects economic development, which affects how we bring traffic and liven our city. Where do you start? Because there's these two often choices. Say you get to the underlying sources of crime, which is poverty and economic opportunity, or the fact that crime is existing and prevents you from making those investments. Where do you start? And how do you do it?
I would need 2 hours for that, but I'll try to condense things as best as I can. You know, the role of, when we talk about community safety, there are two factors to it. A, there's that criminal element, and B, there's that social cost. You have to be able to identify both in order to be successful. Because if you diminish one, you are not going to be sustainable. So when I joined, it was a Toronto police force. You remember that. It was a Metropolitan Toronto police force. We changed to the Toronto Police Service. And that's because we had to start identifying that there's social cost to decisions being made. But number two, it's not about arresting your way out of these things. You have to look at the root cause of behavior. When you talk about gun violence, people do not grow up wanting to belong to a street gang. There are a lot of things that connect, that make that happen. You have to understand that. And if you understand that, you can better spend your money for the proper outcomes that are sustainable. Right now, the way government works, they keep treating the symptom.
Yeah.
You have to be able to understand the disease and deal with the disease. That's where it starts becoming cost effective, when you invest in that. And then when it becomes cost effective, you can start using your funds to do better things, supporting small businesses, creating incentives for how businesses change. It's going from bricks to clicks now. So new entrepreneurs aren't looking for these bricks and mortars and big
Large
offices,
retail spaces,
right?
no.
Because computers were designed to balance the playing field. And now we've got some of these kids that can do amazing things in business, but do we understand that? Do we identify with that? Do we create the right policies to make our city a place where you'd want to invest your time?
And just to maybe push one more button, I guess, or push back on one thing. I get to the root causes, but there is research that shows, most of the crime are committed by a small fraction of individuals. Like 90% of gun crime committed by 5% of the population. 5%, and then 90% of that 5% are the ones doing violent criminal acts. So it's a small percentage that has a big disproportionate effect. I guess I would like listeners to know, or viewers to know, how we get to those small elements of criminality so that you can make those investments that break the chain of sort of criminality and crime and gang violence.
And that's a fantastic question. Because what most governments do is they make it at risk or criminal. And so we try to do these at-risk programs, not identifying that some slip between. So you're right, you're talking about the 5-10%, and then it now goes to 5%. These are the high risk. Nobody understands that, but I had the displeasure of stepping over young, dead bodies, usually killed by people that look like them, over and over again. Understanding that, and then creating the right programs for that, because there's no funding in that. And so I'm running for office because you're right. The numbers are very small at this point. We are moving in the wrong direction. And if we keep moving in the wrong direction, we won't be able to control those numbers. But I think through good people, through private and public, if we utilize our dollars wisely and have a focus on that entity, we'll see tangible differences. We will see tangible differences, and then from there, we will definitely create a much safer city just based on how to focus on that very small percentage that is causing the vast majority of these crimes, including the bail reform, but we can get into that another day. But we're talking about the social entities that we need to do to reduce the opportunity to have those bail reform discovered.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe on that more hopeful note of a possibility for solutions to these seemingly intractable problems, and the fact, you're quite right, you didn't mention it, but we're not like a city like Chicago where that number has just gone way out of control, and you don't know where to start. We're at a point in Toronto where we can make a difference. So with that, I'll end our interview, Mark, but thank you for joining us.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And join us next for our other interviews with mayoral hopefuls.